There is a particular kind of relief that belongs to finding shelter. Not comfort, shelter. The difference matters. Comfort is a preference. Shelter is a need. When the weather turns bad in the backcountry and the temperature is dropping and the trail is getting dark and you come around a bend and there is a building, four walls, a roof, a door that opens, something in you that has been braced against the world releases. You are safe. You are inside. The storm is out there and you are in here, and that distinction, which civilization has taught you to take for granted, becomes the most important thing in the world. What I'm about to tell you is a story about two hikers named Garrett and Beth Pruitt. They are experienced backpackers, not elite, not technical, but solid. The kind of people who plan well and make good decisions and have been doing this long enough to know when a situation is changing on them. On the second day of a 3-day loop in the George Washington National Forest, the weather changes on them, badly. A storm comes off the ridge faster than the forecast suggested, and the temperature drops 15 degrees in 2 hours, and the trail turns to a cold mud river, and they make the call that experienced hikers make. They look for shelter. They find it, an unmanned ranger station, deep in the forest, marked on their map. Locked, but the kind of lock that yields to persistence and a credit card. The kind of lock that is meant to keep out casual intrusion, not desperate hikers in deteriorating conditions. They get inside. The station has been unmanned for years. The logbook confirms it. Last entry dated 2019. But the wood stove is warm. The coffee on the counter was made within the last hour, and the logbook, when they look more closely, has entries from last week, in handwriting that is not human in any proportion they can name. Pull up a chair. The fire's going. The storm came from the northwest, which was wrong. Garrett noticed it first because he'd been watching the sky since noon, not with alarm, just with the habitual weather reading of someone who'd spent enough nights in the backcountry to know that forecasts were approximations and the sky was the primary source. The forecast had called for a 30% chance of afternoon showers, which in October mountain weather translated to bring your rain shell and don't worry about it. What came off the ridge at 2:15 p.m. was not a 30% shower. It was a wall. A solid gray-black wall moving fast from the northwest, eating the sky from that direction with a speed that meant serious wind behind it, and the temperature dropped. He felt it on his forearms, the sudden 10-degree plunge that meant the air mass behind the front was genuinely cold, and he turned to Beth and said, "We need to find something." Beth had already stopped walking. She was looking at the same sky. "Yeah," she said. They were 4 miles from the nearest trailhead, 2 miles, roughly, from the ranger station marked on their topo, a small symbol, the standard shelter notation, with USFS printed beside it in the cramped typography of a 1 to 24,000 scale map. Garrett had noticed it when they'd planned the route and flagged it mentally the way you flag things you don't expect to need. Emergency shelter. Good to know it's there. It was good to know it was there. 2 miles, he said. We move. They moved. The rain caught them with a mile to go. Not a shower, a serious, sustained rain, the kind that finds every gap in your layers within 10 minutes, regardless of how good your gear is. The temperature kept dropping. The trail, which had been dry and well-defined in the morning, was running with water by the time they hit the second ridge descent, the mud soft and treacherous on the switchbacks. They came off the ridge into a hollow and followed the hollow north, and the ranger station appeared through the trees exactly where the map said it would be. A small log-sided building, maybe 400 square feet, a covered porch across the front, a woodshed to the left with a modest stack of split wood visible under the eave. Garrett felt the release, the bracing against the world letting go. They crossed the clearing to the porch and tried the door, locked. A padlock through a hasp, the kind he'd seen on dozens of USFS structures. He looked at it and looked at Beth, and she was already pulling out her wallet. 30 seconds with a credit card, and the hasp pulled free. The screws on the hasp plate had rusted loose from the doorframe, the whole assembly coming away in Beth's hand with almost no resistance. Maintenance issue, she said. "Fortunate maintenance issue," Garrett said. They went inside. The station was one room, a wood stove in the corner, cast iron, older, the kind that would heat the space efficiently if you gave it 20 minutes, a small counter along one wall with a utility sink, a shelf above it, a table in the center with 2 chairs, a set of metal shelving holding supplies, first aid kit, emergency blankets, a few canned goods, a weather radio, a narrow bunk along the back wall, bare mattress, a folded wool blanket on top. Standard USFS emergency shelter setup, exactly what you'd expect. Garrett set his pack down and shook the water off his shell and looked at the wood stove. The wood stove was warm. He noticed it the way you notice warmth, not consciously at first, just a bodily awareness of a room being warmer than a room that had been empty for an unknown period should be. He walked to the stove and held his hand near the door. Warm. Not hot, not recently stoked warm, but the residual warmth of a fire that had been running for some time and burned down in the last few hours. He looked at Beth. She was standing at the counter. She was looking at something on the counter with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "Garrett?" He crossed to her. On the counter, a coffee maker. A standard drip machine, the kind that ran on power. And there was no power in this station. No electrical connection he could see, which meant, he looked more carefully, it was a camping percolator. A stovetop percolator set on a small camp stove on the counter. The camp stove's burner was off. The percolator's sides were warm. He picked it up and tilted it. Coffee inside. Still warm, not just made hot, but the warmth of something made an hour ago, maybe 2. He set it down. He and Beth looked at each other. "Someone was here," Beth said. "Recently. Where are they?" Garrett looked at the door they'd come through, the door with the hasp that had come away in Beth's hand. He looked at the window, a single window beside the door, the clearing visible through it, rain coming down hard, the tree line beyond. He looked at the back wall. No second door. No way in or out except the front. "Maybe they left just before the storm hit," he said. "In that?" Beth tilted her head toward the window. The rain was loud on the roof now, a sustained roar. "Maybe they had better gear than us." Neither of them quite believed it, but the alternative, that someone had been in this room recently, had made coffee and stoked the fire, and then left through the only door without being seen in a clearing with good sight lines in every direction, required its own explanation. And that explanation was one neither of them was ready to reach for yet. Garrett found a logbook on the shelf above the counter. A standard USFS visitor log. A 3-ring binder, sign-in sheets, the kind of record that documented use of the station for maintenance and management purposes. He opened it. The most recent entry was dated October 14, 2019. A trail crew, 4 names, a note about the wood stove damper needing adjustment. He flipped back through the pages. Entries going back years. Hikers, hunters, trail crews, the occasional ranger check. All of it in the ordinary variety of human handwriting, all of it making the ordinary record of people passing through. The last human entry, October 14, 2019. He closed the binder. 5 years. Station's been unmanned for 5 years. Beth was stoking the wood stove with wood from a small pile beside it, a few pieces left from what someone had brought in, enough to get the fire going again. She looked up. So who made the coffee? I don't know. And stoked the fire? I don't know. She put a piece of wood in the stove and adjusted the damper and stood up. "Okay," she said, in the tone she used when she was deciding to table something for later. "Okay, we're inside. We're dry, there's a fire. Let's deal with what we know." Garrett agreed. He put the logbook back on the shelf, and they dealt with what they knew. Wet gear draped over the chairs to dry, food organized, the stove producing warmth that filled the small room within 20 minutes. The rain hammered the roof, and the wind moved in the trees outside, and inside the station, it was warm and dry and almost, in the right light, almost cozy. Almost. Beth found the second set of entries 2 hours later. She'd been sitting at the table with the logbook open, reading back through the old entries the way you read something you found in an interesting place. Not looking for anything specific, just reading. Garrett was on the bunk, not sleeping, listening to the storm ease on the roof. "Garrett?" Something in her voice. He sat up. She was holding the logbook open to the back, not the sign-in pages, the back cover. The inside of the back cover and the last few pages before it, which were not sign-in sheets, but blank pages, the buffer pages at the end of a binder. Not blank anymore. He crossed to the table and looked at what she'd found. The pages were covered in writing, dense, margin-to-margin writing, filling every line of the unlined pages with a regularity that suggested the writer had not needed lines to keep the text straight. Which was the first wrong thing. Writing that regular, that consistent in its line spacing on unlined paper, was difficult for a human hand to produce. It required either a template under the page or a level of motor control that was, in practice, outside the range of human fine motor function. The second wrong thing was the letter forms. They were legible, that was the thing. They were entirely legible, every character recognizable as a character, every word parsable as a word. But the proportions were wrong in a way that he couldn't immediately specify. Not wrong the way bad handwriting was wrong, not inconsistent, not imprecise. Wrong the way a thing made by something that had studied human writing and reproduced it without the underlying physical constraints that produced it in the first place was wrong. Too consistent, too controlled. The letters were perfect in a way that human letters were never perfect, because human letters were produced by human hands, and human hands had variability built into them, and this had none. He read the first line. "The storm will pass by morning. It has passed before. Everything passes." He read the second line. "The wood is sufficient. It is always sufficient when the need is real." He read the third line. "They will come in the night again, or they will not. It does not matter. The record is the record." He looked at Beth. She turned the page. More entries. The same handwriting, dates at the top of each, and he looked at the dates, and his chest did something he didn't have a name for, a physical sensation that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but lived between them. The dates were recent. The most recent was 4 days ago. The entry before it was 9 days ago. Before that, 2 weeks. Going back, he turned pages, Beth turning with him, months of entries, regular as a logbook, in the back pages of a binder that the official record said hadn't been touched since 2019. He read entries at random. November 3. Cold front from the northwest. 2 deers sheltered on the south side of the building until the wind passed. The smaller one was injured. It was not injured when it left. September 17. A hiker passed on the trail below at midday. He did not see the station. People see what the path shows them. The path showed him something else. August 4. The logbook is getting full. I will need to begin another. There is no shortage of pages. There is no shortage of anything here that patience requires. Garrett turned to the most recent entry, 4 days ago. October 18. The season is turning. The forest is doing what the forest does. I have been here long enough to know the difference between a thing that is happening for the first time and a thing that has happened before. Almost everything has happened before. The ones who come for shelter are the most interesting. They arrive afraid of the storm and find that the storm was the least of what the night contained. Most of them leave before they understand. That is fine. Understanding is not required. The record is sufficient. The record remembers even when they do not. Garrett closed the logbook. He put it back on the shelf. He stood with his back to the shelf and looked at the room, the warm room, the drying gear, the fire in the wood stove, the percolator on the counter, and tried to find the version of this that made sense. "We should go," Beth said. "It's still raining." "I know. It's 40 degrees out there, and we've got wet gear and—" "Garrett," She said his name the way you say a name when you need someone to stop building a case and make a decision. We should go. He looked at the window. The rain was lighter now, not gone, but lighter. The wind had dropped. The worst of it had passed through. He looked at the wood stove, at the warm room, at the coffee percolator that had been warm when they'd arrived. He thought about the entry. The ones who come for shelter are the most interesting. They arrive afraid of the storm and find that the storm was the least of what the night contained. Yeah, he said. Let's go. They packed in 4 minutes. Wet gear stuffed rather than rolled, efficiency over tidiness, the calculation of people who have decided that being outside in the rain is preferable to being inside in the warmth, and have accepted the cost of that decision. At the door, Beth stopped. She turned back to the room. She stood there for a moment, looking at the stove, the counter, the shelf with the logbook on it. "Do you think it knows we read it?" she said. Garrett thought about the entry. The record remembers even when they do not. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should not be here when we find out." They went out into the rain. The trail back to the trailhead was 4 miles of wet and cold, and the particular focus of people who are moving through discomfort toward a goal they can name. They didn't talk much. The rain eased further, and the temperature stayed cold, and the dark came down off the ridge an hour before they made the trailhead, the last mile in headlamps, the parking area appearing through the trees like something from a previous life. They got in the car. Garrett ran the heater. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. Then Beth said, "How long do you think it's been there?" "In the station?" "Yes." He thought about the entries, the consistent handwriting going back through the binder, the tone of them, unhurried, observational, the tone of something that had been in one place for long enough that time had become a different kind of thing. There is no shortage of anything here that patience requires. "Long," he said, "a long time." Before the station was built? He hadn't let himself think about that. He thought about it now. The station was USFS construction, probably 1960s or 1970s, the era of that kind of backcountry infrastructure. Before the station, there had just been the hollow, just the trees, just whatever had been in that place before anyone built a building over it. "Probably," he said. Beth looked out the window at the dark forest. "It made us coffee," she said. "Stoked the fire? Left wood?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the part I can't get past. Whatever it is, it made the station usable. For us, before we got there." Garrett thought about that. About what it meant. About the entry. The ones who come for shelter are the most interesting. He thought about what they'd been to whatever wrote in the back of the logbook. A thing of interest. A thing that had prepared for their arrival, or for someone's arrival, the arrival of whoever the storm sent, and had watched them come in and get warm and find the logbook and read the entries and leave. "Do you think it wanted us to read it?" Beth said. He'd been thinking about the same thing. The logbook had been on the shelf in plain sight. The official entries at the front, the other entries at the back, hidden only in the sense of being at the back of a binder, findable by anyone who looked, which suggested that finding them was not prevented, which suggested that finding them was permitted. Intended, maybe. The record is the record. "I think," he said slowly, "that it keeps a record because it wants there to be a record, and we're part of it now." Beth looked at him. "What does that mean?" "I don't know exactly." "Are we in the logbook now? Did it write about us?" He thought about that, about the blank pages at the very back of the binder, past the entries they'd read, the pages he hadn't looked at because there hadn't seemed to be anything on them. He thought about whether he'd looked carefully enough. He didn't say that to Beth. He started the car instead and pulled out of the parking area and onto the forest road and drove toward the highway. He didn't say it, but he thought about it for a long time on the drive home. And 2 weeks later, when he was going through his pack to clean it out for storage, he found a page. A single page, folded in quarters, tucked into the small interior pocket of his pack where he kept his permit and his emergency contact card. A page that had not been there when he'd packed. A page in the handwriting from the back of the logbook. Too consistent, too controlled, the letters perfect in their wrong proportions. He unfolded it. 4 lines. October 22. 2 came in the storm. They were cold and they were afraid, and they found what they needed and they left before dark, which was wise. They read the record. That is also the record. Now. The record grows. They were good guests. I have noted their names. They are welcome to return. He stood in his kitchen with the page in his hand for a long time. Then he looked at the top of the page where a date was written. October 22, the day of the storm, the day they'd been in the station. He looked at the handwriting. He looked at his own name, written in that too perfect script in a hand that had never held a pen. He folded the page back into quarters. He put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept things he didn't know what to do with. He hasn't gone back to the George Washington National Forest. Beth has. She hasn't told him why. He hasn't asked. The station is still there. USFS records show it as a decommissioned structure, low priority for maintenance, last inspection 2021, no plans for staffing or removal. It's on the map. You can find it if you're looking. Beth went back in February. She told Garrett she was doing a winter loop in that area and the station was a useful waypoint. That's all she said. She was gone for a weekend. When she came back, she was fine, normal, herself. But she'd added something to the shelf above her desk, something Garrett noticed the one time he visited her apartment after that. A small notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you'd use for a field journal. He didn't ask about it. He didn't open it. But he noticed that it wasn't empty, and he noticed that the handwriting on the visible page wasn't quite Beth's. The record grows. If this one settled into you, if you're going to think twice the next time you step into an empty building in the back country and find it warmer than it should be, subscribe to Whispers by the Woodline and hit the bell so you don't miss a single story. More are coming. Each one set in a real place in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, each one built on something patient and old that noticed you long before you noticed it. Drop a comment below. I want to know, would you have stayed the night? Because the station was warm, and the fire was sufficient, and something had already noted your name. The fire's still going. Come back soon.